We're going to get into systems part 2. I'd say this lesson is a little more difficult than the last one because we're going to get into a few other systems that are a little harder than something like flight controls and components and things like that. So we're going to start with the ignition system. Ignition system is going to include something called magnetos, which are these components right there at the bottom. All the wiring, your spark plugs, and the ignition switch. So the key and the starter component, the ignition switch. These devices here at the bottom are called magnetos. These are the devices that provide the charge to the spark plugs. And so your ignition system is considered an enclosed system. It's not part of the electrical system. So for us, what that means is if you have an electrical failure, meaning the alternator were to fail or you weren't having any battery power, the ignition system would continue to run. So that's due to these magnetos are actually connected to the engine. So anytime the engine is operating, these magnetos are operating as well. And in the next slide, we'll look at the internal components of the magneto. So they provide power to your spark plugs. And so we have 2 magnetos mounted to the back of the engine. Each of those provide power to 1 spark plug per cylinder. We have a 4-cylinder engine, each magneto providing 1 spark plug. So we have 2 spark plugs per cylinder. There's a top spark plug and a bottom spark plug. Reason for having 2 is redundancy. So there's a couple systems that there's always going to be a backup system, essentially. So if we were to have failure of one magneto, the engine wouldn't stop working and we would then have to glide somewhere safely to land. We have 2 magnetos, so if one were to fail, we have one still providing power to 1 spark plug per cylinder. You would notice a decrease in performance, so there would be a drop in RPM and overall performance, but the engine would still be operating. You'd still be able to get somewhere safe to land. Aside from redundancy, it's improved engine efficiency or performance. So anyone that started flight training has noticed during your run-up check, part of that is doing a magneto check. So you have your ignition switch here, generally in the the bolt position once the engine is already on. And you test each of these magnetos individually by turning the key to the left position or the right position. What that does is disconnects each of the magnetos individually, and when that happens, you'll notice a drop in RPM. And it's normal. Anytime you go from using 2 spark plugs per cylinder to just 1, you're going to notice a drop in performance. So it's a very normal drop. If there's an excessive amount of drop or engine roughness during that run-up check, it's usually pointing to a bigger issue. Most commonly, it's because these spark plugs get buildup on them and they're unable to produce a spark, and so they're considered fouled. So if you were to do that magneto check and you turn it to one of these magnetos and the engine operates very rough, most common cause is spark plug fouling, and there's some procedures you could follow to burn that deposit off. If it gets bad enough though, they just have to be replaced. There's no fixing it. Here's the internal components of a magneto. It's called a magneto because there's a rotating magnet right here. So this magnet is spinning in close proximity to a tightly wound copper coil right here. As it does that, it produces an electric impulse or charge to the spark plugs. So anytime the engine is operating, this magnet is spinning close to the coil, producing an electrical impulse that gets sent to the spark plugs. So when you are first starting the engine, obviously the RPMs aren't high enough for the magneto to produce a strong enough impulse to the spark plugs. So what it does is it slowly builds up an electrical charge and impulse, and then it times it and then sends that impulse to the spark plugs once that charge has been built up enough. Otherwise, if it were continuously dissipating that electrical impulse, it would never build up strong enough to go to the spark plugs, or to be strong enough for the spark plugs to fire. Next is our oil system. There are 2 different types of oil systems you could have. One is called a wet sump, and the other is a dry sump. The difference between those two is where the oil is essentially stored. So with a wet sump system, the oil is stored within the engine case itself. And a dry sump system, like the image here at the bottom, the oil is stored in a separate reservoir. We have a wet sump system in a Cessna. At larger aircraft or higher performance aircraft might have something like a dry sump. So they're going to require more oil, and that oil needs to be stored in a larger reservoir in a different location. Oil has quite a few different functions, lubricating moving parts. So there's a lot of moving metal in the engine itself. Pistons are moving within the cylinders. That's creating friction. So lubricating those parts, cooling, one, by reducing friction, and it's also carrying heat away from that source. Filtering contaminants. So friction is going to happen regardless, and you're going to get some contaminants or buildup or deposits. And so as the oil carries that away, it goes through a filter, and then that filtered oil gets circulated back through the system. Improving efficiency, so it provides a seal between the piston and the cylinder. So the piston, in order to move, there has to be some amount of space between the piston and the cylinder. But if there was a large enough gap, it wouldn't be able to compress the fuel air mixture enough to produce power. And so they need to close that gap by having a very tight space between the piston and the cylinder. And then there are seals or rings around the piston. And those, along with oil, produce a really strong seal. So it's able to move freely, but it also produces a strong seal. So you're able to get a really good compression. Our cooling system, this looks kind of complicated, but we don't really have a cooling system. The air cools our engine. So we don't have liquid cooled or anything cool like that. For our aircraft, it works the same as this image right here. We have air inlets in the front near the propeller. So as the propeller is rotating or as you're flying along, outside air goes through those inlets and it circulates around the engine, cooling it, and then that air escapes through the bottom. There's a few design features that help that air circulate. So you see these kind of fins on the cylinders right here. You may have noticed them on motorcycles before. Our engine also has the same cooling fins. So these increase the surface area and ability to distribute air across the cylinders. And it might be kind of hard to see this picture, but there's this rubber seal at the top of the engine right here. That's called baffling. And so that rubber lip forms a seal between the engine and the cowling. And so that's able to direct and circulate air, especially towards the back cylinders, because you can imagine as you're flying along, the front cylinders are getting basically all the air, all the attention. And so you need a way of circulating air towards the back cylinders. Otherwise, you would have relatively cool cylinders and then hotter cylinders in the back, and you want it to be evenly distributed and producing the same amount of power. And our exhaust system, also pretty simple. So during the exhaust stroke, like we talked about last time, the exhaust valve opens up, and as the piston is driven upward, it allows the exhaust gas to escape, or the burnt gas, after the combustion cycle. So we have these exhaust pipes that are leading from this section right here where the exhaust valve lets the air out. Those eventually combine into one exhaust manifold, and then that gets led outside the aircraft. So it's going to be on the bottom right in a Cessna, so you'll see the exhaust pipe down here at the bottom. And our heating system, also pretty simple. So using the same image right here, this orange portion right here is what's called a heater shroud. So the exhaust pipe goes through kind of like a metal, it's a shroud, but it's a metal surrounding, and the air within that shroud, it captures the heated air from outside the exhaust. You're not just funneling exhaust fumes into your aircraft, hopefully not. So it captures the heated air around the exhaust pipe, and it funnels it into the aircraft through these orange tubes right here. So there's a lever inside the aircraft right there underneath the right yoke. One is for air, one is for heat. So if you open up the air valve, there's a door that's on the side of the cowling here that opens up, and it just allows outside air into the aircraft. If you pull the heat lever, it opens up the valve right here. I don't know if you can see the pointer very well. Opens up a valve right there and allows heated air inside. I will say you definitely want to use a combination when using heat. You want to open the air valve as well as the heated air, because the heated air is too concentrated. It'll melt the tips of your shoes. Not really, but your toes will get way too hot. So you'll want to use a combination to mix it. It's almost like getting in the shower and you just go all the way to heat. It's just way too hot to stand, so use a combination of kind of hot and cold. Here's another angle. There's that tube. Maybe I can zoom in. There we go. Probably still too dark for you guys to see, huh? No? So here's that shroud surrounding the exhaust pipes. So the exhaust pipes come from the cylinder. They eventually combine into one exhaust pipe right here. And then there's that shroud that captures that heated air and funnels it into the aircraft. The fuel system, most of the time it's going to be about the same. There are slight differences between an N model and an S model, which is comparing carbureted versus fuel injected. The most simplified version is kind of this diagram here at the top. We have fuel tanks that are in the wings. And then those fuel lines go down the frame just in front of the front windows. And those eventually combine at our selector valve. From there, it goes through a fuel strainer and then to the carburetor. So that would be a carbureted model. Now this beautiful thing to your right is a fuel injected model. I'll say this looks more complicated than it actually is because it's printed on paper. It's one-dimensional. If you were to kind of picture it like this image right here as three-dimensional and trace where that fuel is going, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So here at the top are your, I don't know, it's not working. A little delay. So your fuel tanks. Here at the top, there's a line that goes through the roof of the aircraft that allow those to breathe or distribute air between both of the tanks. That way you don't get a vacuum in one, the other one's using fuel. Those lines go to the fuel selector valve. The fuel selector valve is between the two seats by your feet. You can select which tank you're using. From there, it goes to a fuel reservoir tank, which then goes through an auxiliary fuel pump, through the fuel shutoff valve, again, which is also by your feet, a fuel strainer, engine-driven fuel pump, fuel air control unit to this distribution valve. So this distribution valve is going to be, oh, never mind, it's carbureted model. I'll find you a better one. So the distribution valve sits on top of the engine, and you'll see a bunch of red lines coming off of it that go to all the cylinders. There is an engine-driven fuel pump, although the carbureted model works off of gravity. So because the wings are above the engine or above the carburetor, gravity is able to feed that to the carburetor. A fuel injection system requires pressure in order for it to work. So as the engine is operating, it's also operating an engine-driven fuel pump. And so it's continuously pumping fuel. You have an auxiliary fuel pump, which you would use for priming the engine for startup. And it also serves as a backup. So if you were to experience an engine failure, one of your first things that you check that's on your checklist is to turn on the auxiliary fuel pump. If you were to turn that on and the engine were to start, that tells you, oh, my engine-driven fuel pump failed and there wasn't enough pressure to keep it running. You definitely want to get familiar with this. For anyone flying an N model, you're kind of lucky in the sense that it's very simple. If you're flying something like G1000 or an S model that's fuel injected, You will be expected to understand everything here. Years ago, they expected you to draw this out during a private check ride. I've heard it less common lately. But just for understanding purposes, I would definitely recommend learning to doodle this, draw it out a few times. That didn't happen to me during my private check ride, but my commercial check ride, one of the questions was, oh, can you draw and explain the fuel system? And so you have to draw this entire thing. Nothing to note are drain valves. So it says drain valves right here. So under each of the tanks, there's a spot where you can test the fuel using a fuel tester. This is what one of those valves would look like. So this is set in the tank, and then you just apply some pressure, it's spring loaded, and then it's gonna allow fuel to fall inside the cup. And then you would examine that for any contaminants or water. Again, if you're flying an N model, you're very lucky in that there's only 2 points to test. In an S model, there's 13. So there's 5 under each wing and then 3 under the plane. So you get to get your knees dirty a little bit trying to get under the plane and reach for that one. FADEC, we're not really going to talk about too much. This is more going to be complex aircraft. So it's a full authority digital engine control. So it's a computerized system that controls your fuel distribution and your mixture and things like that based off of performance and temperatures. It's really just trying to optimize everything based off of your performance, the fuel consumption, and what would give you the best horsepower. There's a few scenarios where you can experience abnormal combustion. First one we'll talk about is called detonation. This is going to be most similar to engine knocking or pinging. So you may have heard of that happening in cars. I would say it's less common now, probably older models. So if you happen to use a lower grade of fuel for the engine that you're using, it's going to cause an explosion of the fuel air mixture. So typically it's an even burning of the fuel air mixture. It's very smooth and even. If that were to just explode, that would cause detonation. So that could cause damage to your pistons, cylinders, eventually engine failure if components are broken. That's one of the reasons why while we're testing our fuel, we're also looking at the type of fuel that's in our cup. The fuel that we use is 100 low lead. So 100 is the grade of fuel, and it says LL for low lead. If you go to the gas tank filling up your car, it says unleaded. So cars do not use lead in their fuel anymore. Planes do, unfortunately. So that's to prevent detonation. And 100 low lead is dyed with blue, so you'd notice that the fuel is blue. If it's any other color, you should ask questions. It should definitely not be yellow. If it is yellow, that's jet fuel. Don't go. Another one is pre-ignition. So that happens when the fuel air mixture combusts before your piston reaches top dead center. So if the piston's on its way up and that ignites before it reaches top dead center, it's going to force the piston downward, or it's going to apply a lot of stress to the piston and the connecting rod. That's usually caused by hot spots in the cylinder. So if there are contaminants in the cylinder, or if the engine's just running too hot, you could get some hot spots, and that's going to cause it to ignite before it should. On paper, these sound very similar. Generally, the cause is slightly different. Detonation, again, is using the wrong grade of fuel, the lower grade especially, and then pre-ignition is most likely hot spots. I've attached it's like a PowerPoint or PDF from the FAA on the Google Classroom about this topic. It goes over them in a lot more detail with like images and things. So I would check that out when you get some time. Next we'll get into the electrical system. So just a general overview of how electricity works. So it's based off a flow of electrons. This is a diagram of just how a battery works in general. So you have a negative terminal and a positive terminal. And the electron flow is just tracing of where to share an electron. So if there's a deficiency in electrons, that's going to pass along kind of like dominoes. So typically it's going to flow from an area of high electrons or negative area to a positive area where there's an electron deficiency. So we capitalize on this reaction by powering different components in the airplane. So looking at the battery again, we use a lead acid battery, kind of similar to what you have in the car. The entire purpose of a battery in an airplane and a car as well is starting. So we generally only use the battery for starting the engine. After that, the alternator takes over and the battery should just remain on standby, essentially. It's also there for backup, so if we do have an alternator failure, we're not just going to lose radios and lights and flaps and things like that. We're going to have a battery as a backup source. Usually, depending on the age of the battery and conditions, it'll last about 30 minutes. So if you do experience an alternator failure, then you can expect about 30 minutes. Could be less, could be more. Here's a diagram of the electrical system. This isn't specific to the Cessna. You have to refer to the POH to see kind of the individual differences for a Cessna. This is just straight from the PHAC, but it's essentially the same. There's a few minor differences. So like I said, the battery right here, main purpose is for starting and to serve as a backup. And our master switch right here, these red switches, which you will see right there on the far left on that panel on the image in the back of the classroom. It's a little bit higher up, but master switch is generally going to look the same in most of these small aircraft. So the master switch has two sides. It says ALT for alternator. The right side says BAT for battery. So it's considered a split rocker system. So there are two buttons or switches. So you can isolate one if you needed to, but generally we just have them both on. So by turning the master switch on, you are connecting the battery to the rest of the electrical system, as well as the alternator. I recommend writing out the steps of engine startup and what happens once the engine's already running. It kind of helps you make sense of what's happening. So just to run through those, just like a car, when you turn your key, instead of having a master switch in a car, there's positions on your key, where if you just do one click for your key, it kind of turns on the radio and lights and things like that. That's essentially turning on your master switch. For an airplane, we have a separate switch to actually turn that on. So you would turn on the master switch and then turn the ignition to the start position. So the start position connects your battery to this starter motor right here. So the starter motor is getting power now, and it has a gear on a pin, and that gear begins to rotate and extend. When it extends, it connects to, I should have an image. So there's a gear right here next to the propeller. Your starter motor is kind of where the cursor is. There's a starter motor kind of low down here, and then it extends a gear, connects to this starter ring, and rotates the propeller. So if anyone's started flying yet or started training, when you turn the key, you notice that the propeller moves slow. And so that's just the starter motor rotating it. And what happens after that is, so as the starter is rotating, it moves the prop, which is moving the pistons and the cylinders. The magnetos then start to move. Once they build up enough charge, they send an impulse to your spark plugs. The spark plugs fire, and then the engine is able to operate on its own without the starter anymore. So once the engine's started, you disengage the starter by returning the key to the both position. So if you just let the key go, it goes to both. It doesn't stay on start. Otherwise, you'd hear grinding, which isn't good. So key goes back to both, which means you're now using both magnetos. And you have an alternator right here that is connected to the prop with a belt. So now that the engine's running, the alternator is also rotating now. So the alternator takes over in place of the battery, and that provides power to all these components right here. You'll see this word right here, it says bus. This is an electric bus. So this is basically like a power strip that you put behind your TV or computer. It's distributing power to all these components and also protecting them. So between the components and the bus, you have circuit breakers. So if there was an issue or if there was an overcharge of one of these components, the circuit breaker would pop and disconnect it from the system. So that way it doesn't become damaged or overheated and start a fire or something. So the battery contactor connects basically every system. So it goes to the battery or the master switch. So once that's on, it goes to the battery contactor and tells the battery what to do. And so if you could have a contactor failure, so if the battery just wasn't coming on, the battery could be good, but the contactor could be failed. Yeah, sometimes batteries just go bad. Yeah, it could be contactor issue. Usually the problem is people leave the master on. So they finish a flight, forget to turn the master off. Somebody goes to fly the plane the next day and the battery's dead. If that happens, the mechanic can charge the battery. So they'll go out there with like a generator or something, charge it up. If that doesn't work, it won't hold a charge, then they replace it. Here's a better look at your alternator. This is not A172, but the location of the alternator and connection is the same. So it's connected with a belt to the prop. So as the prop is rotating, once the engine's started, it works pretty similar to the magneto in that there's rotating magnets inside your alternator, kind of inside of this stator or tightly wound coil, and that's going to be generating AC current, alternating current. At some point, the alternator is going to, it's going to go through this rectifier diode, and that's going to go to DC current. So the system itself is a DC system, direct current, but alternator is going to produce alternating current. Should have one right there. So that's an alternator. If you want to pass that around, recommend bracing yourself. That's even heavier than the magneto. So this is why planes weigh as much as they do. There's a few things too. You can have over voltage in one of these systems, in which case generally the system would just shut down to protect itself. That's going to be with the alternator control unit. Usually we inspect the alternator belt during our pre-flight. So if there's any sort of damage to the belt, don't fly, it needs to be replaced. So usually you're looking for like fraying or like any nicks or damage to the belt. Most of the time, if you do experience an electrical failure during flight, it's because the belt snapped, not because the alternator just failed. But either could happen. Alternator is also pretty efficient at producing sufficient power during taxi. So if you think about taxi, the RPMs aren't very high, and so this belt isn't spinning very fast, but it's able to produce enough power for everything. Sometimes you'll get a low voltage annunciator during taxi, and that's just because the RPMs are slightly too low for the generator to power everything. So in a G1000, you'd hear like a chime. There'd be a low voltage annunciator, and then the battery is just you're using the battery at that point. Fix for that is just a little more RPM. So once you come to a stop, put the RPMs back to 1,000, and that'll be enough. So this is just kind of what you would get from the POH and the system section. You're not going to get asked about this on the written test. This is more so just to apply towards like flight training and like an introduction to your systems. So system itself in this model is 28 volts. You have a 60 amp alternator and a 24 volt storage battery. Reason for the difference between your battery and the system and the alternator is that you need enough pressure to charge a battery. So if you were to have a 24 volt electrical system or a 24 volt alternator, it would basically be like a trickle charge, or it could potentially not be enough to even charge the battery. It's like trying to use a very small charger on like a large device. Like if you've ever tried charging an iPad with like a phone charger, it's going to be pretty slow. Same concept. So you need enough pressure in order to charge that battery. If you're flying a G1000, they also have a standby battery, so it has 2 batteries now instead of just 1, and that's just for backup because you're using so much electricity. Brake system, very straightforward. Under the left seat pedals, there's a cylinder, and then you have a hydraulic line filled with your brake fluid. So when you depress the toe portion of your pedals, that creates pressure within the brake line, and that's going to squeeze brake pads onto the disc that's on the back main wheels. So pretty simple. The right seat does not have these, but they are interconnected to the same system. And so each pedal is connected to one brake, and so you have to apply the same amount of pressure to each side. Sometimes, depending on the plane, they may be a little wonky. You may have to apply more pressure on one side and a little less on the other in order to have even braking. Otherwise, you're going to veer off a little bit. Takes some getting used to, like taxiing and applying brakes and like rudder pedals and like trying to keep everything on center line. Stall warning system. This is a pneumatic system, which is what we have in Cessnas. On the front of the left wing, there's a small hole. As you reach critical angle of attack or just a really steep pitch, there forms negative air pressure, like a vacuum, in front of the wing. And what that does is sucks air through this opening right here, and that's connected with a tube to a horn that's mounted kind of next to your head. And so that horn is near the air vent that's near the left side. So air is being sucked through this horn, and inside that horn is a plastic reed, and that'll make the most beautiful sound you've ever heard right next to your head. So it just works like a wind instrument. There's a plastic reed inside there, and as air is being sucked across, it's going to make that lovely noise. So during pre-flight, we just inspect this, make sure there's no clogs or bugs or anything like that. If you're brave enough, you can put a napkin over it and suck air through it, and you can hear the horn. Up to you. I've never done it. I've seen some devices too. They're almost like little plungers where you put it over it and then you draw air out and you can hear it. You can just look with your eyes. It's not that big a deal. You can have electronic methods. So this tab would be mounted to the leading edge of the wing. So if any of you have flown 6 Uniform Tango or Romeo Romeo, they have these. So as your pitch changes in the plane, it's going to apply pressure to this tab differently, and it's going to move that tab, and that's going to send feedback to an angle of attack indicator that's mounted inside the plane. And so that'll tell you whether your angle of attack is good, green, it's going to go yellow, and then red if you're stalling or close to a stall.